was 17 years old, having a great time. I was like a kid in a candy shop. During spring break, we went down to Panama City Beach, Florida. Young, dumb, full of cum, ready for a great time. The essence of the film is quite powerful. The underlying story and messages really explores these interconnections between our modern day pop culture, what we see on music videos and the conditioning and programming of a lot of pornography, how that impacts young adults to have this sense of neediness to have validation through sexual interactions and one-night stands and hookup cultures. There's obviously a deep need for this connection. That mindset that becomes deeply ingrained and kind of normalized, that is okay to have a sense of entitlement over sexual experiences, and then the effect that can have long-term in a relationship. I spent years really, really lost and confused inside and not knowing, having no idea, who really am I? Had a lot of healing to do, had a lot of discovery to do. I needed to find myself. What does it mean really to be a human in the world? What does it mean to be a man? What does it really mean to be a woman? It's just invited me into explore deeper parts of
aside from my soul. Welcome back to the Inspired Evolution. And we have with us today, inspiring our evolution on their own inspired evolution, Shay Douglas. Shay, how are you there, brother?
Oh, brother, so good, man. I love the energy. I'm going great. I'm stoked to be here and looking forward to this conversation.
Touch wood, man. It is such a pleasure to have you here. For those tuning into Shay for the first time, go check out Earth Heroes TV. So he's the passionate creator, director skills peppered in there. You can see some really lush, just editing going into Earth Heroes TV there. And he featured in the Netflix documentary Liberated. And on the back of that, we're going to discuss that today. He actually has become what you could argue a face of transformation for change for an entire generation in some ways. He is a young director himself. And in there, I guess his aim is probably to empower others through, his message, his own personal transformation. He leverages visual storytelling really well. Go check out his YouTube channel. I'll put a link to that below. But then, even just watching what Liberated was as a Netflix documentary, and if you guys haven't checked that out, that probably will be a good reference point for you guys to go check out, and then head back over to Shai's channel and check out what After Liberated looks like. Quite a depth of conversation available there, and then all the way through to what is now Earth Heroes TV. Shay, thank you so much for being here with us, man.
Oh, mate, thank you. No, I'm really, really honored to be a part of this conversation with you, man, and inspired by a lot of the work that you do in the world. It's so important and relevant, and the significance of what we're moving through collectively and also individually. It's a really important time today to have these open conversations, to learn, to grow, to evolve, and to live an inspired life. So, man, I really appreciate everything that you're doing in the world, and honored to be here, mate. Honored.
Touch wood, you're way too kind, bro. Thank you so much for your blessing. So I want to tune in, and I kind of want to let the rubber hit the road straight out of the gate. So I'm when I'm online and I'm checking out Shay, your work at the moment is really interesting, Shay. There's the call to awakening and coming back to who we really are is so front and center in your work. And one of your biggest calls to action is look within. And I absolutely adore that. Now, one of the key things in there, though, is almost like there's two Shays online, though. And one is from Liberated, and you look at that, and then there's so much in there. And then there's the you today. And it's neurally, I was watching my networks kind of go they're the same person. Which one of my mentors, Vishen Lakiani from Mind Valley, goes, you should grow so much that you have to reacquaint yourself to your friends every time you meet them. And I'm like, shit, I think that's Shay.
Absolutely, man. Yeah, and I think that's been generous, that there's only two versions. I would say there's been multiple versions of Shay through this life, which is a beautiful thing. I agree with Vishen there as well, that we're in a time where we are, again, individually, for myself, I speak for myself mostly, but I also notice it in many others, that we're shifting so fast and so rapidly, and reintegrating, parts of our own psyche and parts in really embodying, who it is that we truly are, because it's easy to put on, the facade and the mask and play these roles and get carried away with this identity and get lost in that, in a sense, and then just always come and bringing it back to those simple things, as you mentioned, and which are ultimately fundamental truths. Yeah, I really like where this conversation is going, because it's so, sometimes it's so simple, it's so simple, and at the same time it's very complex. It's very, like, I wish it was just easy to understand, but it's there's multiple layers to it, and there's a lot of realms of understanding what it means to truly know thyself. And yeah, man, I'm really excited to unpack this in this conversation with you, man.
The facades and roles that you mentioned is really interesting, because one of the conversations I wanted to have with you today is, when I look back at Shay in Liberated, maybe give us some context. What was Liberated about for those that haven't tuned into Liberated? Now, I'm like riding on the shoulders of having researched you thoroughly. For those that haven't watched Liberated, can you give us a quick rundown on that, and then maybe I'll ask my question as of there.
Absolutely, man. Yeah, so a little bit of quick background story for context. When I was 17 years old, I was gifted the opportunity to go and leave Australia. I was living in Far North Queensland in Cairns, tropical, beautiful paradise, and was following my passion of being a professional athlete, and got offered a scholarship to the United States to study in university. And in that 4-year period, living away from family, living away from friends, in a whole new environment and completely new city, I was loving it. I was having a great time. I was like a kid in a candy shop, and particularly where I was living, just north of Chicago, it was so exotic to have an Australian accent in the middle of the Midwest America, and that played into my ego and played into my benefit, particularly with the ladies. And we were having a great time. I was with a whole bunch of other international students, and during spring break, we went down to Panama City Beach, Florida, which is where the film on Netflix was primarily recorded. And we were there for what I would call young, dumb, full of cum, ready for a great time. And that's where a lot of the magic was captured, which the essence of the film is quite powerful. The underlying story and messages really explores these interconnections between our modern day pop culture, in terms of what we see on music videos, and the kind of conditioning and programming of a lot of movies and romances, as well as going to the extremes of looking at the role of pornography in our modern day timeline, and how that impacts young adults to have this sense of neediness to have validation through sexual kind of interactions and one night stands and hookup cultures. And you go out and you have these moments that is somewhat lacking of intimacy, but there's there's obviously a deep need for this connection. Yet it's kind of just a random person that you meet that evening, and then you go off and go about your day-to-day life and kind of forget about it, in a sense. So there's still somewhat of a disconnection fundamentally, and then also exploring on a deeper level how that mindset that is becomes deeply ingrained and kind of normalized, in a sense,
in your subconscious.
through even through our culture, that is okay to have a sense of entitlement over these sexual experiences, and then the effect that can have long term in a relationship, in terms of its how detrimental and destructive it can be, particularly that mindset of entitlement. And the film goes on to explore that a little bit more in depth, and it's a very kind of it's a very dark side of human behavior, ultimately, which is a sad reality, that those kind of sexual exploitations and domestic violence and so forth actually exist in our world, and it's very concerning. And that was part of the motivation to make that film for the filmmakers, the director and the producers, particularly because they wanted to bring this question to the surface around, what does it mean really to be a human in the world? What does it mean to be a man? What does it really mean to be a woman? And that's kind of catapulted me further on my journey, because I'm one of the main subject matters as well. And it's just invited me in to explore deeper parts of the human existence and the purpose of our beingness and why we're here, the meaning of life, all these wonderful questions to inquire within, with ourselves, and have conversations like this that are where we can attempt to articulate for those who are tuning in and listening what it really means to be alive in this world today.
There's a really interesting theme that is getting unpacked in there, which is actually the sense of belonging that we have, and how fundamental that is to our human needs. And I'm sort of drawing on that because having watched you go away on this experience, it's very much like a lad's trip, and just going, being one of the boys, and you can see that there's like everybody in like this experience is in their network, and there's a sense of belonging in this culture that's created. But also what you mentioned was quite profound in terms of like there's this sort of backwash of like media that sort of infiltrates into our subconsciouses, I don't know that word, and like programs us, that then normalizes a whole bunch of stuff. It's not lost on me right now that you're creating conscious media, maybe even to sort of pivot and combat some of that that's going on in the world. But yeah, it's intriguing to sort of see how fundamental a need belonging really is to us as human beings, and yet how media can subversively infiltrate that. Your thoughts?
Oh, 100%, I agree, man. And this is a great area of discussion. And I've kind of like, because for a number of years in my life, I was my whole identity of what I had created for myself around being this athlete and being this guy. I was kind of playing that jock role in life, and then all of that crumbling down through injuries and stuff. I spent years like really, really lost and confused inside, and not knowing, like having no idea, like who really am I? And what intrigued me most was
So
to
is that
explore.
during the period that you had the identity of an athlete, or is this post? Sorry.
Like post
Yeah.
in the process. So for more context as well, we filmed the documentary series in 2013 when I was living in the US, and then took the production company about 5 years to release it. And in that period, I had a lot of personal injuries and going through my own catalyst for change, which was through suffering and pain ultimately, because this whole kind of lifestyle and identity that I had built up for myself came crumbling down, and I had to choose another way. And so in amongst all of that, then, a few years later, the film starts coming out, and then I'm really having to do the deeper inner work to
Which is,
resolve all of
I
that
just want to
within me.
jump in. I know I should not interrupt, but I just want to
Sure.
jump in there for a sec, because I think from the outside looking in, the natural sort of story arc is like, holy shit, Shy went away, had an amazing spring break. Then the documentary comes out. He watches a documentary and goes, "Oh my god, my whole soul cringes." Right? And then he goes, "Fuck, I need a change." Right? But it's really interesting because you actually already started to shift way before, because there was such a lag time between when the documentary was filmed and came out, that you'd already started to crack. Yeah, and you're describing the cracks that were like part of your transformation. Please, I just jumped in there just to sort of,
Yeah,
yeah.
no, thanks for jumping in, man. You're totally right. Like, and that's what I've realized in doing this work, and ultimately through me going through my own journey helps me to recognize when others are going through that same process themselves. And what I find is that it ultimately takes, some kind of, usually a health problem that enables us to like break through on a personal level. And that was the case for me. I had my third knee reconstruction. It was a major operation, huge surgery, which I didn't realize until later, but that's actually quite a traumatic kind of process to go through, to be drilled under, even though we're out, under the drugs and anesthesia, the body biologically goes through such deep kind of manipulation and suffering and trauma that it remembers it on a cellular level, that there's a lot of numbness. And the beautiful thing is that there is a lot of hope, because all trauma can be healed, whether it's biological, emotional, and so forth. So that was kind of the beginning of my journey. I realized, wow, I got a lot of healing to do. I got a lot of work to do on myself, and really started opening up the floodgates, because by this point I was starting to be a little bit more curious and open, and I love traveling. So I kind of set off, and it was almost like I had created this my own rite of passage, in a sense, where I knew that I had a lot of healing to do. I had a lot of discovery to do. I needed to find myself, in a sense, and that led me on a path to explore these practices of yoga and meditation and permaculture and gardening, and spent a lot of time in like these communities that were really loving and welcoming, and get a true sense of belonging. As you mentioned, like the significance of that in our DNA through thousands of years as human beings. And it encouraged me to look back through history, and that's what I love to do, to look at how the ancients, our ancestors, had kind of evolved through time, and were able to get to such a point in time as we are in today, in such kind of prosperous, abundant time of history. But the hardship that they would have had to go through in the past, and also look at the significance of how this sense of community can support young boys to become men, and what kind of, even in our modern day, there's a lot of cultures around the world. And as I was traveling, I was starting to realize that these cultures had a process for this, which had been lost in the West, and I'd certainly had no experience or awareness or understanding of what that looked like to go through a process of coming into manhood. And, even for example, when I was traveling in Vanuatu, they have this crazy tradition where the young boys, they climb up this tower, they tie vines to their ankles. It's like a bungee jump, and they literally like jump face first, plummeting to their death off this huge structure, and then to be saved by the vine. But when I started to look at these cultures that are still alive today, and how they do these rites of passages, they all had a similar, as you said, like story arc, or they had a similar kind of key foundational points in the process. And one was coming face to face with death, ultimately going through some sense of real suffering, real hardship, some sort of pain. Even in the Pacific Island culture, where they're needling with the tattoos, that is not that's not kind of a fun experience. It's extremely painful to sit there and really come into your center and accept and allow the reactive emotions of pain and hurt to just pass by and come into full acceptance with all of that. And so, I mean, kind of to backtrack a little bit on your question, when you're asking around the role of our media today, I started to really understand the significance of stories that repeat in these patterns in our own minds, that get so ingrained into us. And I thought, well, how did our ancestors do it? What happened back then? And what I realized is that they would have spent a lot of time around fires, where they would have had elders and uncles, and they would have had stories that were ingrained into their young boys, that were stories and conversations around honor and dignity, and responsibility, accountability, and ways to serve, and calling these young boys to be men. Whereas in today's world, like, how many of us are glued to our screens? And so instead of these stories coming from our closest loved ones, where we have this deep sense of belonging and trust and connection to, we're getting infiltrated through the stories on our screens, the stories on Netflix, the stories on our social media pages, and they are now replacing the stories from our connected family, and they are shifting the way that we create our society and our culture today in the modern world. And a lot of the time, these stories, because it's unregulated and it's free to everyone to access, we tend to, particularly around taboo subjects like sexuality or sex, we can be led to explore those realms of uncharted territory on our own, which can lead to being exposed to harmful content that is not in a is not going to benefit, you know, young adults to have a deeper awareness as to how to engage in these really significant areas of life, such as, you know, sexuality and relationships. And so I guess one of my stories to kind of highlight that was, I remember when I was 13, you know, and I was just new to high school up in Cairns, and we were sitting around the lunch table, and I'm just trying to make new friends. I'm trying to fit in, and just naturally, the way that humans tend to do that is to, you know, have conversations and morph into what the kind of group, you know, you kind of have all of these such subtle subconscious cues to feel a sense of acceptance to the group, and you kind of end up going along with what everyone else is saying or doing. And I remember this guy, he was only 13, and he was telling me about how he had sex with this girl already, you know, and at that stage I hadn't even had pubic hairs, and I'm already starting to feel the pressure of engaging in a sexual activity. And so it just led me to be curious. And I remember going home and jumping on the internet. It was dial up at the time, and I'm exploring, you know, like what pornography is and what it's all about. And I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing, but then what I realized as an adult, just kind of looking at particularly the stories in our modern kind of erotica online, is really detrimental to you know, the relationship with women, because ultimately most of the time it's all about the man's pleasure. It's all about the man getting what he wants and deserves, and then reaching the final, you know, destination, and having his ejaculation, and preferably all over the woman, but so that she, you know, she's in a position of degradation. Essentially, it's all about the man kind of triumphing in a sense, and that kind of repeatedly playing over in the mind can lead to experiences in the real world that just kind of replicates that in a sense. And so, you know, there's many layers to it, and media and what we consume in terms of on our screen is kind of one level in a sense, and then the next level, which really I was encouraged to do, and it kind of came to me in a very abrupt way when I was sitting in a 10-day meditation in Malaysia doing a Vipassana experience, and it really led me down the path to resolve a lot of my own unresolved emotional trauma from my childhood in relation to my father and my mother. And so that's kind of like a whole nother area of discussion, but it yeah, it really led me to look at an area of my life that I had suppressed, all these deep emotions so deep down inside myself, and based on my observation of my environment, which was the challenges that my mum and dad were going through in their relationships, and I had unknowingly adopted a lot of these patterns and these programs of just doing what my dad was doing, which was cheating on my mum and not honoring the relationship, and bringing a lot of pain into the household. And so I just repeated that pattern, and it definitely didn't serve my relationships, I tell you that much. And it wasn't until I was having this experience in the meditation where it was coming to me, and it was a very rude awakening. You know, if anyone who's listening now, and has been through, you know, sometimes multiple spiritual awakenings, you'll know that sometimes it's not as fun as we kind of make it out.
I would say more often than not, actually. it's trial by fire, touch wood. Yeah, but yeah. Please, yeah, continue.
It's like a slap across the face. You know, it's like, whoa, it's a big shake-up and realization. And at the time, it can be hard to realize, like, and it evokes so many deep questions, like, why is this happening to me? Like, and that's a beautiful thing, because it just invites us to go deeper down those pathways to explore, you know, what are we really here for? Is, you know, like, are we really truly going to be okay and make it through it? And then instead of seeking that kind of support and validation from other people outside of ourselves, which is really necessary in life, but it it cultivates a stronger resilience in ourselves to be able to hold our own self in a way that we can move through the world, and we can, it's like this concept of being unstoppable, because people on the outside are always going to criticize, or they're always going to say things, but we can have a stronger sense of knowing who we are in our core, and we can accept, the pain from our past and the mistakes that we have, and integrate that into our body, into our being, and have a vision and an intention that is supportive and conducive of connecting with others and having compassion and forgiving, which is another great segue I would love to go down with you, which is so important in the realms of, healing our relationships, particularly to our family members. And I love, Ram Dass is one of the greats who says that. He's like, you think you're enlightened? Go and spend a weekend with your family and see what
That's
comes
actually
up.
one of my favorite quotes. I actually I don't know if you've managed to check it out, but there's actually a podcast, the Ram Dass podcast. And in Ram Dass's infinite wisdom, I just love this dude. He's actually audio recorded himself through his journeys through India, through his process of enlightenment, not knowing that he was going to become enlightened, right? And where there's gaps in him keeping an audio journal, there's other people that have kept an audio journal at the same time, like his travel companions. And post him passing away, they've actually stitched this whole thing together into this podcast, so you can actually follow along Rupert Ram Dass's journey and transformation from Rupert to Ram Dass, and all the bits that come in, and it's actually really hilarious. I just wanted to share this with you because I think you'd love it. You can actually follow along on his journey, because he goes meets meets the sage, and he's in India, and he has this incredible time. He's enlightened. He comes back enlightened. He's been sitting at the feet of his guru for a good 3 months, comes home, literally rocks back up to America wearing robes and sandals, and he goes, I'm enlightened, and it's just everything looks different and everything's different. And then there's this journal entry of when all it took for the entire thing to just be, after 3 months of deep, solid, profound inner work, he's a psychologist, to be blasted to smithereens. Was literally his dad just going, so Rupert, what do you do for work? And it's just and just the way he describes a torrent of rage that sort of matches within him is it's gold. It's gold. Sorry, I've totally digressed from your point, but you were making a point about family. Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's so good, man. It's so true. And I've really been blessed, with the family that I have around me, and it's easy. I think it's easy to choose the path of staying in grudges and staying in bitterness and staying in resentment. Although that often, that pattern and those emotions seem to arise within me, particularly to certain people in my family. However, as they do, I think that's the real key in this journey of evolution that we're all on. And it's a personal responsibility that we all have to be aware when they arise, and, to go through that alchemical process in the body to choose to change it if it's not serving us, and or serving our relationships, and to instead shift it to that level of I'm so sorry, thank you for showing me what I don't want to be like. Thank you for showing me what I am capable of actually changing and also being into. And I love you so much. Thank you, even with all of the mistakes, even with all of the hard times that we've been through. And I think that element, it's so healing, and it's a deep sense of forgiveness. And oftentimes when we're forgiving, what I've found, forgiving other people, we're forgiving our family members for the things that they may perhaps exposed us to when we feel like we're just a young child, and we're we don't really have the awareness or the emotional intelligence or the psychological knowledge and wisdom that we develop as we get older as adults. But then as adults, when those patterns arise for us again, that's when we can reclaim it, and we can go back to those places, and we can say, wow, actually, you know what? Like, I love you so much, because without those experiences in my life, I wouldn't be the person I am today.
There's a really interesting point in there. Yeah, about forgiveness being our responsibility, and just how much differentiation there is between boy and man, and that delta potentially just being encapsulated in the word responsibility. Yeah, that's really present for me as you're sharing,
Thanks for sharing.
because I can just imagine like our inability to share, forgive. That's very boy-like tenant. Yeah, that's mine. That's mine. My country, your country. Where? Whereas it takes a level of work to be responsible for your emotions, be responsible for everything that's come up and gone, hey, like, this is what it is. And I actually, even though I cannot understand or find it difficult to comprehend your choices, I accept you, and can thus forgive.
That's huge, man. Thanks for sharing that. I totally agree. And I love Tony Robbins' definition of responsibility. And it's kind of in the words. And I've been so inspired recently to study more etymology.
Yeah.
But responsibility is the ability to respond. And as a child, our ability hasn't really been, we don't really have much of a capacity to respond to difficult situations. I mean, think about a 5-year-old child. Even they're still, you still got to almost protect them. You feel like you want to protect them with bubble wrap, because they're still so young and innocent and delicate and precious. And as they grow older, there comes a point that that young child now has to cultivate within themselves that sense of resilience and strength to face the adversities and challenges of our world that we find ourselves in. Because fundamentally, this reality is, it is can be challenging at times, and it would be nice to kind of bubble wrap ourselves through the world and through life, but ultimately it's through these experiences that we have where we can either we break down and we go through a melting pot of a moment. I'm sure many people have been there. It's the dark night of the soul, where we really start to realize, and sometimes it comes through this sense of betrayal, because the people that we thought we had a sense of belonging to, that we trusted so much, that we instilled all of this true depth of meaning, and then they suddenly go against what they said they would, and they go against our back, and then we feel this like total annihilation of our soul, because it's like, oh my God, what just happened? And then it's in that moment, it's like the pits of hell we find ourselves in. And then to volunteer with our will to actually face and confront that moment, rather than continue to bury our head in the sand. I think that's where the strength of character resides, that we're able to burn out of the ashes. In a sense, it's like the story of the lotus flower blooming out of the mud, and that becomes our pillar of strength, the foundation of our existence. And that enables us to move forward with true dignity and honor in the world, because we're no longer kind of bypassing all of the bad stuff and the hard stuff, but we're accepting it, and then we're actually utilizing it to propel us into our purpose even more. And what a beautiful story, what a beautiful way to be.
You mentioned choosing, if like you mentioned family, and we've been talking about belonging. There's a whole piece in there about our friends being the family we choose. I see this a lot in conscious circles. People will say, my friends are the family that I choose. there's totally, we can talk about Liberated and, the friends and the family you chose at that time. And potentially, as you've gone through your evolution path, it's probably even worth us sort of highlighting and even just asking the question in terms of how many of those friends are still your friends and potentially who your family or friends is now. But also to go deeper based on what we've been discussing around forgiveness is, I'd just love to get your thoughts on how do you know when it's time to move on from a friend, like completely from that sense of belonging that you've cultivated for so many years with someone, versus dig in, do the work, forgive. I imagine it's completely subjective given every situation, every individual, every moment. Relationship dynamics is difficult to speak to. But I think in that sense of belonging, I think especially with potentially your journey, and maybe you can, discuss the Liberated, not to sort of blame your friends, but sort of just, like just the culture that you had around yourself at that time and then the shift that you made. How do you know when it's time to forgive, and how do you know when it's time to sort of actually move on? Yeah. Do you get the essence of my question?
Absolutely, man. It's such a great question. And yeah, I agree with you that it is somewhat subjective to everyone's experience and individual circumstances. And I guess for me, yeah, on some levels, ultimately, it's also universal in a sense. On a broader stroke, we all have these moments in our lives where we go through change, and we grow, we become a new person, we assimilate new information, and we reintegrate parts of our self from when we were a child, and we do the healing work, and it's a beautiful path to be on. And then we realize, wow, this, all of these people who I'm surrounded with, they can't even have a conversation around these topics because it's not even in their awareness. And that's also, an opportunity to love them and love them where they're at, and also to seek what would fulfill those conversations. And I guess there's kind of two areas that I want to speak to in this sense. And one is a quote from one of my good meditation teachers. His name's Tom Cronin from Sydney.
Oh
And
yes, we've had Tom on before. He's
we
beautiful.
had Tom on the
Yeah.
show. Yeah, he's such
Yeah,
a
yeah, 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 yeah.
great
Yeah.
guy. And he always reminds me, he says, the wise do not bewilder the ignorant. And I'll repeat that again: the wise do not bewilder the ignorant. And I mean, I'm not saying that I'm a wise person or anything. I think we all have and really receive our own internal wisdom from our life experiences. But what I realized is that I would have these realizations, and then I would, like verbally diarrhea it, and I have to tell everyone, it's like, oh my God, you got to have this same thing, you got to do this. And it was like, I was so excited by the shifts that I was
Yeah,
having.
I've been there. I've been there. Meditation. I was a meditation teacher. It's like, you've got a toe ache. Have you tried meditating? You cut yourself. Have you tried meditating? It works for everything.
Totally,
Sorry,
man.
I digress.
Totally.
Please.
I think like many of us have been there. It's a beautiful place to be as well, because there's a real passion behind that to get the message across. And at the same time, a lot of people might not be ready for that information, and we all got to kind of, if someone forces something upon us, we have a natural resistance to repel it. But if we choose that for ourselves, again, we have to volunteer to walk down that path of forgiveness, that path of compassion. We have to choose that for ourselves. And that's where the real power is, because when all things may seem to be going against us, we choose to face it, we choose to confront it, and we choose to work through it. That's where the real power resides. And so I think, oftentimes in the conscious and spiritual community, which is a really beautiful community of human beings that are doing amazing things in the world, sometimes we can somewhat isolate ourselves and put ourselves in a category of people that is somewhat disassociated or even bypassing the true reality of the world that we find ourselves in. And, like I've got a very diverse range of friends at the moment. Some of the most kind of quote unquote conscious or spiritual people that I know, they don't even practice meditation or talk about yoga or do any of these things that we would consider somewhat, connected to the divine. Yet what they do is they, feed people on the street. They go out and they're having conversations with those who are really struggling, and they're just serving in a way that they can to show up for their community and the people in their sphere. And they're not worried about how wise they are, or how, they naturally see the true wisdom that we all have as human beings, and the importance of that feeling, that sense of like I'm actually cared for and I'm caring for others, like I'm loved, and I'm so loved that I want to be a loving person and show that, and do that by people who, probably need it the most. And that's, just a beautiful thing, because sometimes our friends who were not able to hold these conversations with, when we would really yearn for it, to have these like really kind of high level experiences that we want to share and so forth, they might not be able to hold those conversations down. That's just an opportunity to love them where they're at, and maybe they're not serving in certain ways, but I also feel that because we've grown up in a lot of like smaller, cliquier family circles. What I mean by that, we usually grow up with a primary he and a primary she, a mother and father, and maybe our brothers and sisters. Where in the past, we would have had this community, this whole tribe, this village.
Yeah.
Everyone was deeply interconnected and entwined, and we wouldn't need to fulfill all of our fundamental needs from one or two people.
It's insane. Oh my God.
Exactly. And I think that's where we fall short a little bit in our modern day. And we're having a shift, because we're realizing that we have certain needs, and we're seeking them from, a variety of other people. And that's where the conscious community comes in, and it serves in a beautiful way, because now we can start to open up to people, and cultivate trust, and cultivate these deeper connections, and have these conversations that enable us to move forward in the world, and they give us a sense of empowerment and belonging. And that's what I've always found in relationships, is that when we're able to go to those deeper places within ourselves, evidently, that invites others to go there too, but it just invites us to connect deeper. And if some people aren't able to go to that place within themselves, that's okay too. That's totally fine. And that's just an opportunity to show up for them and support them and be there for them, because ultimately at some stage in our life, they may not be going through it right now. It may be in 10 years time that they go through their, breakdown and breakthrough, and we can, have that loyalty to still show up in their lives when they need it the most, rather than it being about me projecting on what they need, and so forth. And so,
And what's
life's all
your
about,
need in that moment? That's
exactly,
pushing that conversation further.
100%. It's like, oh, I need to be seen as this guy that helps people and serves the world. But then again, people who do that generally aren't doing it to be seen and getting significance from being, hey, I'm the helper, and I'm the guy who does all of that. But just letting things evolve naturally in their own timing, I think it's relevant in relationships. And that's a beautiful thing about this podcast is, we can inspire, like in the words, even inspired. Dr. Espen talks about this a lot, but it's ultimately inspirited. It's in our spirit when we're moving through these moments that we feel intuitively in ourselves, this creative capacity to move through the world and live our lives from a sense of creation, and living in that place in our relationships. It's like, okay, if I don't feel inspired by these relationships, that's okay. Like, it doesn't mean I have to stay stuck in here. We're constantly moving and changing and evolving, and I can choose lovingly to navigate my way into a more inspired environment that is conducive of those creative juices flowing. And that might be like, well, I just need to get outside and go for a swim in the ocean, and suddenly, that shifts everything in a moment. And so I think, that was the long version of the
No, I
short
really
answer.
appreciate you. No, I really appreciate you unpacking that, because I think it was a question on a ridge. Yeah, it was, yeah, fine
It's a
hair
good
ridge.
question. What do you think? Like, if say for example, you know, this is a big question, particularly in intimate relationships and loving, like, you know, people who cultivate monogamous relationships and have the intention to have a long lasting relationship, when, you know, because they people grow at different stages, right? Like it would be nice if we all grew and evolved together, and we are somewhat doing that in a sense. But when things get sticky in a personal relationships, do you suggest like it would, it's like, okay, it's not working for me now, I've kind of, you know, evolved, or you're evolving faster than I am, so we should just go our own ways? Or do you think it's relevant to stay together and stick through it and go through the hard times, and, you know, just hope that maybe I will grow at that same level too, or that they will grow at that same level too? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so generally when I'll put a big fat disclaimer in straight away. Generally when I get asked to speak on male, female, it's more masculine energy, feminine energy. And I can talk about the meta sort of scale of those two things at a great deal. But when it comes to the finer dynamics between two individuals, like I do life leadership career coaching, which is basically purpose coaching. I give people what they want and then give them what they need. So it's life leadership and career coaching, which is basically purpose coaching. Um, and in there, like there's a conscious intention why I prefer not really to do relationships, even though many times in those life coaching conversations we do talk about relationships. And the reason being, one person is so dynamic unto themselves, and another person is so dynamic unto themselves. And when you actually make the intersection of those two Venn diagrams together, a third entity is created, and then the like infinite complexities that sort of, you know, spark and fly off those two things coming together. This third entity is what you're kind of coaching now, without actually having the third person in the room or the second person in the room. You've just got the one person in the room, right? So there's a lot in there. But one of the key things to answer your question succinctly without the disclaimer is, I think ultimately we have to look within ourselves to find out what our values are and live true to ourselves, right? And so it's unfair for me to actually answer that question, because Amrit's archetype is Captain Commitment. Yeah, touchwood. Like that's just who I am as an individual, right? Touchwood. So, and those are choices that I will make because that's the character that I assume in the story that is Amrit's life, right? So, when we talk about the importance of stories, which is what we have been talking about, not to sort of, this is going to sound pedestal-y, and it's really not my intention, but there was, and maybe it doesn't. In fact, I'll de-pedestal it. I would never have had the courage to do what you did at spring break. Like that just would not have happened in Liberated. Like Amrit just was not that guy. I just could not have the courage to do that. Now, because the spring break was portrayed, like Liberated was portrayed in such a light, it makes it sound pedestal-y, which is anti my intention altogether. In fact, there was an Amrit at that age that would have looked up to Shay and gone, fuck, I wish I could do that, right? But that was just not Amrit's DNA at all. And so I think we sort of have our purpose and our stories carved out within us, right? And a big part of me is like, if I zoom out of this conversation, I said I was going to give you guys eyes. If I zoom out of this conversation, I'm also really conscious of just your purpose and story arc as well, brother. Like, you know, having gone through like that period and having it so widely publicized, and then having done your work and then realized you're on a trajectory, and then that being like a massive dive charge that gets sent into the submersions of your being when it finally gets released, and then you're like, shit, okay, now I really got to show up to do the work. And then how public that whole thing is, and yet just how much you carry, but then get forced to do your own work and then continue to show up the way that you are. That's a beautiful, epic narrative story arc for the character that you're assuming in your life, right? So you had to go through what you had to go through. For me, I'm Captain Commitment, and I know that about myself. So, and I'm very conscious when you're coaching to not allow your own biases to sort of come into someone else. So it's very difficult to relate to people when it's like, you should probably leave is not something, Amrit. It feels very like rubbing the cat the wrong way, you know? But then also, touch wood, I've made decisions in that way where I've chosen a partner and lifestyle where it's like, I know that about my character, so I make my decisions based on that being factored in. And so, yeah, very difficult to respond to that. But each person has to understand for themselves really what the essence of what your work is look within. Like when you go deep inside, are you coming closer back home, or are you being led further and further on, like, off kilter? And it's not a very difficult question to answer, actually. It does take a moment to just sit and be present with yourself. And then if you're feeling more and more centered by, like, yep, me following through on this is going to work, and I just need to, like, I would say man up, but just, yeah, man up for a sec and just go through with it. Let's just soldier through the storm. Or if it's like, actually, me going through this feels like I'm jeopardizing more and more and more elements of myself, and I feel like I don't really know where this is going. Not from a place of I need to know where things are going, but actually I'm corrupting my values in the process. At that point, I think something's gone awry. And then you need to really ask the question, potentially. Yeah.
Yeah, man. Well said.
Um,
It's a really good point you make. And it is like, I mean, we all have our, tendencies and our character traits that are ultimately patterns. And this is what I love observing in nature. Like I've gone on this path to look at how, forests, for example, are, self-watering and self-fertilizing, self-regulating, they're self-sufficient, particularly like ancient forests that have been around for thousands of years. And they're in this diverse ecosystem of plant, fauna, and flora, and animal life, and so forth. And our human communities, our human nature is just very much a part of that ecosystem in a sense. But we've done a very successful job in removing ourselves, and to our detriment, of course, to these isolated little cubicles in our homes, and away from natural elements of life, of the seasons, of the cold and the hot. And we've insulated ourselves in the aircon and in the heaters, and um, it has kept us in a state of comfort
comfort
and
and convenience. Yeah.
convenience, exactly.
Yeah.
And but we have these, like you were saying, with in terms of relationships, is knowing our own, um, you know, our own self, and particularly in how we tend to relate to others, based on our past experiences, but bringing it back into the present, just making that choice. Do we really want to continue repeating those patterns, or do we want to, shift and change those patterns? And that's the point of
Yeah.
empowerment right there, which is a point of awareness, which is self-realization. It's like, oh, wow, I realized that, for example, I'm Captain Commitment, or for my example, in the past, I wasn't committed at all. And then after we realize that, then the choice becomes self-actualization, where we get to make the choice to go, okay, I wasn't committed in the past, but now I really see the value of commitment, because my parents worked through their hard times together, and they're still together, and they love one another 30 years later. Actually, I want to choose that for myself. And that's the powerful point, that we all get to, you know, choose who we want to become, not be a, victim of our past, but, be a creator of our destiny into the future. And that's a beautiful place to be too.
This is it. It's the segue. I've been hanging for this. So we're talking about relationships with others and family and self-awareness, self-realization. You mentioned this in your work, and I've found myself saying this a few times. You mentioned this even in the beginning of this podcast. Men being alienated from their rites of passage and not having initiations. I think I almost feel like we've been alienated from ourselves because of how far we've been alienated from these rites of passage. I don't necessarily buy into the conspiracy theories that we were intentionally stripped of them. I do think comfort and convenience have just been something that we've continued to barrel down, because who's to tell us that life has to be hard? And then we've sort of ended up in this very padded, insulated space, where one of the first things to go was intentional hardships for men. And I, having gone through my own challenges in life, I'd look back at, even what happened in Liberated, and I'm like, well, that's the modern rite of passage. And as fucked up as it was, that's the modern rite of passage. Like, I look back on my 18th birthday, which everyone's like, you can drive now, you're a man. And all I really had to show for that was a really bad hangover and a really fucked up liver the next day. Yeah. And it's like, what did you go kill? My liver, really? Like, and not that killing makes you a man, but do you know what I mean? Like, there was no real stepping up to any plate. And then 21 was much the same thing. Just got really, really drunk back then. And it was just, I see what are these really important moments in time. Maybe it's 18, maybe it's 14, maybe it's 21. Different cultures have different wisdoms. But we don't have these rites of passages. And so much so, I'll elaborate on the sentiment further. I clearly remember when my wife gave birth, like I was there, touch wood, and it was a pretty incredible experience. She went in a girl and she came out a woman. Now, I know some women tuning in are like, that doesn't always happen. That's not always the case. My humble perspective, this is just Amrit's perspective on things. She went in a girl, she was carrying for 9 months. You can argue that even some of that process from the 9 months initiation from my son being born into the world, she has had to put the life in her belly before her, right? So she's had to, you talked about, tattoos and like you sitting and finding your center, through some of these cultures where like you're literally getting tap, 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 like the needle hurts and you're having to come back to your center. She has to get up, she has to walk around, she has to go to work, she has to do all this stuff whilst prioritizing someone else over her for an extended 9-month period. Let alone then she goes into this like birthing portal process. And so much of her has to step out of the way for that to happen. So much of her has to actually die. We can talk a lot unqualifiedly about, just how much of energy, is stored in the pelvis and, how much of a woman's pelvis has to give way and all the traumas in there that have to sort of move emotionally to sort of then, allow life to come through. And then watching her go through that epic process and go, holy shit, that is exactly what a fucking rite of passage looks like. And I shouldn't swear at it, but it's huge, yeah, like it's intimidating. And then going, I have not experienced anything remotely close to that. And then going, we as men really are alienated from our rites of passages. And ultimately, thus, our power, right? Because in that moment, and I'm going to stitch this all together, hopefully. You mentioned empowerment and belonging. And in that moment, my wife came back and she goes, there's this thought that I had that women all over the world are doing this all the time. There are women all over the world doing this all the time, like they're birthing. And she felt connected to womanhood as a whole in that moment. Yeah. And I think part of me is biased and goes, maybe that's why the future of leadership is women, because they've actually got rites of passages and they actually come home to maturity and step into their power. Whereas for men, I don't know where we find that. Like, I'm going through my rite of passage, learning to be her man as a dad, as a father, stepping into more and more responsibility. But I didn't have the physical challenge. It's more the emotions and the character that I'm assuming on the daily has to sort of catch up and integrate the shift. Rites of passage, bro.
Oof, man, that's a really powerful, beautiful story, Share. And I tend to definitely agree with you. Like, I know for certain that in my family, the most powerful people are the women. particularly my mom, who's led the way and shone the light for the rest of us to kind of take those steps towards, more embodiment, more love, more compassion. And yeah, I mean, oh man, I totally agree with you. And it seems like, I mean, even statistically, we know in Australia that, particularly around the suicides and the mental health, that men we struggle. We go. It's hard for us. It's hard for us too, and particularly when you were talking about the masculine, feminine energies, as you mentioned before, that we have. We are kind of we bind ourselves in these boxes and to try and serve our family in ways that don't give us much meaning in life, and we're insulated. And I mean, we haven't even created intentionally these processes for us to go through, because they have to be created in a sense. Like, it's for women, for example, like you said, when they're going through the birthing portal, which is, it's literally like a portal into higher dimensions. We don't really, we haven't got any of that. And I think there is a huge responsibility for us to go about that, particularly in our local communities, because I see there are a lot of, and I want to give credit to men in the world who are creating these environments for a lot of men's work, these kind of rites of passages, and these opportunities for men to grow and evolve. And I was on a men's retreat a couple of weeks ago, actually, and I was so inspired to see men who brought their son along with them to these experiences. They're doing the work together, and that was full power. That was beautiful, and I think that's really important that we do that these days, where we're growing together, and particularly for like, to see older men. We have these archetypes through our different years, and sometimes we have young children who are mentoring the elders. It's not always age becomes irrelevant in a sense. So there's a lot of different dimensions to it, and I think it's important, obviously, to respect our elders and listen to their wisdom, because they have a lot of life experience and a lot of life knowledge that they've cultivated and literally been through. But then at the same time, having open hearts and curious minds, and a willingness to grow and evolve. And I think it's going to serve ultimately ourselves and also our friends and our family.
I love that. Shay, can I ask you, what is your mission in life?
I love that question. That is a beautiful question. My mission I mean, I only just turned 30 years old, so I feel like I've got a lot of life in me yet, and I think the best is still yet to come. And my mission right now actually is relatively simple, because I've realized I've had the fortune and the privilege to be able to travel to a lot of different destinations around the world, to have wonderful experiences. And I'm in a moment in my life where I want to kind of somewhat scale back and simplify, and I want to focus on creating a family. And my mission would be to to show up in the most strongest connected possible way for those who are in my field, in my environment, and to serve them as much as I can, and just be the best human that I can be in the world. Because, again, without going down the conspiracy rabbit holes, I think we may be presented with more opportunities for growth. And what I mean by that is, when we go through challenges, it's an opportunity to grow stronger. And we may be faced with some more challenges collectively, societally, individually. And I think they're all opportunities. When there's resistance, there's opportunity to grow. And so I think it's important, and part of my mission is to be able to cultivate that inner strength within me, and then to be able to share that to support others to find that place within themselves as well.
Shay, mate, I definitely want to thank you for being here today and having this chat with us. Yeah, it felt like a yarn. You called it a yarn when we started. It felt like a yarn, but filled with so much wisdom. And yeah, man, just acknowledging you again for just how much work it takes to, yeah, just show up again and again and again. And I think when we talk about belonging, there's so much subconsciously that gets triggered in our beings because we're so wired as a species for belonging. And yeah, just the light that Liberated was portrayed in and put you in, and then just the evolution that you've been on through there as well, again and again and again and again, in light of all of that. It's been, you can just tell that it's just trial by fire, but it's also really just refined the sword. Yeah, just really acknowledging you, brother. Thank you so much for showing up to do the work. Yeah.
Oh, it's my privilege, man, and I really appreciate you and everything that you're creating and doing in the world. And it's exciting. Like, again, I feel like I got so much to learn still. There's so much more life to experience. So I'm excited more than ever. You know.
Yeah, and I think there's an amazing opportunity there for those that are inspired by what you're inspired by, Earth Heroes TV. They can learn out loud alongside with you as well. Yeah, we'll put a link to Earth Heroes TV in the show notes below. Yeah, if anybody wants to connect with Shay, any better place, in your humble opinion, anywhere that you want to recommend people to reach out?
Oh, thanks, man. No, I appreciate that. Earth Heroes TV has been a bit of a um, creative project that's been ongoing, and blessed to be able to create this platform to allow others to get their voice out there as well. You know, I think we're living in a time and day and age where we can learn so much from one another just through these conversations like this, you know, and be able to support each other to ultimately go on the journey to discover deeper parts of ourselves. You know, I hope that this conversation has supported those listening to be able to have those deeper questions within, you know, your own lives. And I think that's a really beautiful moment, you know, to self-reflect, self-inquire. And that's a constant ongoing process. It's not like we do it once and then we're done. It's like, wow, we've got to check in daily, you know, we've got to check in sometime hourly, you know, so, oh my God, we've got to check in sometimes every moment. So yeah, it's a beautiful remembering process.
Thank you so much, bro.
Thanks, man. Appreciate you.
Thank you so much for watching this video all the way to its end. Obviously, you absolutely love this podcast, and I want to thank you so much for watching this all the way through. Here is another video that's perfectly curated just for you to watch as the next best video to keep your inspiration flowing, to keep you evolving, to keep you yelling. Check it out now.